Okay, hello. So I'm going to be talking about the Belait language, which is another language of Borneo. But interestingly, we'll see that there aren't really many similarities with the Central Bornean languages that we've just seen. And in fact, there are more similarities with the Hau kind of alternations in some ways. So I'm quite happy to be following both of those talks because both of them feed quite nicely into this talk. Okay, so we know now what symmetrical voice is and Western Austronesian voice from the previous talks. But one thing that I just want to draw attention to is that, as we've seen, symmetrical voice alternations are usually two or more transitive type clauses where the subject could either be the most agent-like argument, which I'm calling the actor, or the most patient-like argument, which I'm going to call the undergoer. Although some researchers have proposed that this is a distinct alignment type, if we look at nominative accusative and ergative absolutive alignments, we can see that the actor voice alignment is basically identical to a nominative accusative active clause, and the undergoer voice alignment is basically identical to a basic ergative clause. So I think that the symmetry that we'll see in Belait is a good indication that symmetrical voice is actually split ergative alignment. And there's one asymmetry as well that we'll see that kind of supports that idea. Okay, so previous research on Western Austronesian voice alternations, a claim that I quite liked was Sonja Riesberg claiming that Tortoli has the most symmetrical voice system that's been described. And when I was researching Belait, I kind of started to think, well, Belait seems to be at least as symmetrical as Tortoli, maybe more. I don't know. Okay, and then so we're going to look at the symmetry of Belait in terms of the syntactic behaviour of subjects and non-subject arguments, restrictions on definiteness, null arguments, and we're going to see one important asymmetry in TAM. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Belait. So as I said, Belait is a language of Borneo. It's spoken in Brunei, a tiny country in the north of Borneo. And there's only around 100 or 200 speakers left of Belait, and there's been very little previous research. So the data that I'm going to be talking about today comes from a small corpus of texts that I've recorded and collected, and it includes both elicitation and acceptability judgments, as well as naturalistic texts. And this is part of an ongoing documentation project. And I just want to acknowledge and give thanks to some of the key collaborators and consultants of the project here, without who none of this research would be possible. Okay, so over the past, I think especially 10 years, but further as well, more and more Western Austronesian languages have been tested with a similar series of tests to show the argument structure, subjecthood, and the behaviour of the grammatical relations. So some of the main tests that have been conducted on a wide variety of languages include looking at the verbal morphology to see whether one clause type is more marked than the other, looking at word order, looking at relativization, as we saw earlier, control constructions, quantifier flow, and definiteness restrictions. And then I'm also going to look at null arguments, as we saw earlier as well, and the aspectual interpretation in Belait. Okay, so looking first at the verbal morphology of Belait, I want to say that Belait has just two different clause types, actor voice and undergoer voice. There's no other passive. And the verbal morphology does not change depending on tense, aspect, or mood, like it does in many Philippine-type languages. These are the only verbal affixes or verbal morphology that exist in the language. So we can see that in AV, we have this oo. In AV, we tend to find the oo, whereas in UV, we just have the e. Very, very kind of symmetrical. Another possibility is to have a in AV and an in UV. There are some other options for alternations, but I don't want to spend too long talking about them. But just want to say that it's very, very symmetrical in all ways. Okay, when we look at the word order for basic transitive clauses, again, we find a very high level of symmetry. So for a basic active voice clause, we find the active voice marking on the verb, and the act argument, the old man, must precede the verb, and the undergo argument must follow. In undergoer voice, it's the opposite. So we find the undergoer voice marking on the verb, and then the undergoer precedes the verb, and the actor follows the verb. Okay, when we look at relative clauses, similar to what we saw earlier, if we want to relativize something, we must use the correct voice morphology in the embedded clause. So if we want to relativize the actor, we have to use actor voice in the embedded clause. So for something like the child who is eating the rice, is my child, we have to use actor voice in the embedded clause because we are relativizing the actor. If we want to relativize the undergoer, we have to use undergoer voice in the embedded clause. Yeah, so we can see that it's the pre-verbal element that's been relativized in undergoer voice as well. So the rice that my child ate was put on the table. We have to use the undergoer voice. Control constructions are similar again, in that we have to use the correct voice in the embedded clause as the controllee. So in my data, this is from naturalistic data, in my data I only have examples where the embedded clause is in actor voice and then the actor is the controllee. I don't know if it's possible to have an undergoer voice control construction, but that's something that I want to find out. Okay, so one other area of symmetry, or a little bit of asymmetry here, is quantifier flow. So quantifier flow has been suggested to be a good test of perhaps subjecthood in some languages, or perhaps core argument status in other languages. In Belait, we can see that in actor voice, if we have a sentence like the children, then we have actor voice by, storybook, and then we have all at the end. This quantifier all can refer to either the children or the books. So it can either mean all the children buy the books or the children buy all the books. In undergoer voice, it's a bit different. In undergoer voice, the quantifier can only refer to the undergoer argument. So I've just shown here different locations where the quantifier could occur in the sentence, and all of those would be correct or acceptable, but wherever it occurs in the sentence, it can only refer to the undergoer argument, which is the durian. Yeah, so whether it's all the durian eat them, or the durian all eat them, or the durian, eat them all. It's only the durian that is full. So in quantifier float, we do see a bit of an asymmetry in that the actor of AV can float quantifiers, the undergoer of UV can float quantifiers, the undergoer of AV can, but the actor of an undergoer voice construction can't. Okay, so in terms of the syntactic tests we've shown, there's quite a high level of symmetry between actor voice and undergoer voice. So let's have a look at definiteness and see if there are any restrictions on definiteness of the arguments in Belait voice alternations. So when I was doing elicitation and acceptability judgments with speakers, I noticed that they seemed to prefer to use definite arguments in the kind of privileged argument position. So that's the actor of actor voice and undergoer voice. But if I asked if it was possible to use an indefinite argument, they said it was okay, it was acceptable, but they didn't tend to produce that kind of argument. So I had a look at some naturalistic data to see what the situation was when they were using it. And I found that it does seem that there's a preference for definite pivots. Pivot is what is generally referred to in the literature for the actor of AV or undergoer of UV. But it doesn't seem to be a strict requirement. So I noticed that when we have a definite actor acting on a definite undergoer, undergoer voice seemed to be used more frequently. When we had a definite actor acting on an indefinite undergoer, actor voice was used more frequently, but undergoer voice could be used as well. When we had an indefinite actor acting on a definite undergoer, undergoer voice was preferred, possibly, but actor voice could also be used. And when both were indefinite, I only found actor voice, but it was a very small number of clauses, so couldn't say for certain. But what we can see is that there is variation there. And just for some examples of that I found with indefinite subjects, got things like any big trees, undergoer voice, cut down first. We'll notice that there's no actor in that clause, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute with null arguments. And another example, on the mountain, many people from around the world, actor voice, like my child. Okay, so when I was looking at the naturalistic data, I also noticed, like we saw in the first talk, it was very, very common to find clauses with no arguments at all, where just the verbal morphology basically tells us what's going on. So I was wondering which arguments can be dropped, which arguments have to be used. And basically, I don't know if there's any pattern. I couldn't find any pattern. It seems that any argument can be dropped. So we've got a little excerpt here, which is all using actor voice. So we have where I've written actor and circled it, that's where I would assume an argument would be if it was overtly expressed, but there was nothing there. So in this sentence, we just have make forest at that place or chop down when dry. But we know from the verbal morphology who's doing what. In undergoer voice as well, it's the same story. So we can have a sentence like, when it's finished, burn, set aside, clean, by us or us earlier. And we know again from the verbal morphology who's doing what. So I had a look again at some clauses to see what was going on there. and I found that in AV could we have null actor arguments in AV? Yeah. Could we have null undergo arguments in AV? Yes. And both? Yes. And then in undergo voice, it's the same. I mean, it seems like there's some variation between different speakers, and that's something else to investigate. Okay, so far, looking at the syntactic properties of actors and undergoers in AV and UV, we can see quite a high level of symmetry. So word order, the actor of AV and undergoer of UV must be preverbal, whereas the undergoer of AV and actor of UV must be postverbal. Morphological marking, indexed by verbal morphology, but no nominal mark at all for any of them. Relative clauses, yes for the pivot arguments, no for the non-pivots. Control, yes for the actor of AV, no for the non-pivots. Quantifier flow, yes for the pivots. And then a bit of asymmetry in the non-pivots. Definiteness can be either, and can they be unexpressed? Yes, any. Okay, so far they seem very symmetrical. But I noticed that there's one major asymmetry, which is related to the aspectual interpretation of the clauses. So I haven't talked about it, but in some of the previous examples, there was a marker nga, which often occurs with UV clauses. And when I asked speakers about it, they would say that nga and UV should go together, and UV is past tense. UV shows an action has already happened, or UV is a finished action. And that nga kind of showed this, or there was a strong relationship between UV and nga. And this plays out in the naturalistic texts as well. So there are at least 3 different preverbal markers. So we've got nga, which is associated with this UV past tense or perfective aspect type situation. We've got akal, which is some kind of progressive type marker, and kira, which seems to be some kind of future marker. So in AV, in 19, we can use any of these markers with an AV verb. So we can have the fox, then we can either have nga, perfective, progressive, future, eat in AV, the fish. And that can mean the dog ate the fish, the dog is eating the fish, or the dog is going to eat the fish. In UV, the only marker that can occur is nga. So we can have the fish, nga, UV, eat, the fox. Can only mean the dog ate fish. If we omit nga with UV, it still means the dog ate the fish. So again, looking at the naturalistic data, I was wondering how strong the association with nga and UV actually was. So I looked at a larger sample this time with 404 clauses, and in there were 96 UV clauses, but only 36 occurrences of nga. So that shows a difference between kind of what people say in elicitation and what's actually found in the naturalistic data, and that the association can't be that, I mean, it's not a definite association, it's not a very, very strong association. What I did notice, though, is that in the first 3 texts are talking about kind of general habits and daily life, and there was a much higher use of AV clauses in those texts, and very few UV clauses were used. The 4th, 5th, and 6th texts are talking about kind of historical traditions or childhood activities, and in those texts, although they did still use quite a few AV clauses, they used a lot more UV clauses than the first three texts. So that does seem to show that there is an association between talking about the past and talking about general habits and the voice alternations. So the Belait voice alternations seem to be syntactically very symmetrical. Both seem to be transitive clauses, but they're aspectually asymmetrical. So this seems to be reminiscent of cross-linguistic findings where if there is a split ergative alignment, ergative clauses are always aspectually perfective or perfect, and non-ergative clauses are always imperfective or non-perfective. So if we think that Belait UV clauses are ergative, then they seem to somehow fit into this cross-linguistic typology, but not totally, because AV can also express perfective aspects if it's marked with that. So I'm not really sure how it fits in, but it seems to be associated with this finding. Yeah. So I think that this provides evidence that we are dealing with split syntactic ergativity in Belait, and there's some kind of aspectual split. But I want to do some further study on how aspect is expressed, because the data that I was working with is based on narrative data, which isn't that great for looking at aspect. So I'm going to look at things that are more targeted to elicit talking about the future and lots of different types of things to get some better data for the future. Okay, thank you.